Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti a questa Masterclass, grazie per essere qui. Spero che il film vi sia piaciuto. Questo è sicuramente uno dei film più belli e interessanti che abbiamo visto quest'anno. Come sapete, il film ha vinto il premio per la miglior regia e il migliore interprete a Cannes, all'ultimo Festival di Cannes. È stato presentato anche alla Festa di Roma nella sezione Best Of e ringraziamo anche Paola Maranga per questo, per averlo scelto. Io mi chiamo Hakim Zejjari, lavoro per il Domani, sono un giornalista e vi prego di accogliere con un calorosissimo benvenuto il regista Kleber Mendonça Filho, Wagner Moura anche.
Grazie.
Obrigado.
Bello, no? Vedere un film del genere mentre fuori c'è il temporale, essere trasportati in un altro mondo. Allora, prima domanda, Clever. Più che un film noir, un thriller politico, si può dire che questo è un film sulla memoria collettiva, ma anche sulla mitologia dei film della tua infanzia?
Well, thank you for the question. I really think that when we tell a story, it could be the most intimate story, but we have social references and we have cultural milestones. And for example, I think cinema for me has put timestamps in my life and also music. I remember when a very important album came out, and I remember the year. For example, I'm a big fan of Prince, for example, and I was a teenager in the 80s, and when his albums came out, they gave me time references, and the same thing about cinema. So when Steven Spielberg's Jaws is in the film, it's not only because I like that film very much, but because it became a popular phenomenon. But on top of that, it's also because the city I come from, Recife, has a real shock problem. So when you add the two ideas, in my mind, they make sense.
Quanto è importante raccontare l'amnesia politica che c'è stata in Brasile e secondo te i film migliori nascono nell'urgenza, nelle difficoltà politiche e sociali?
Yes, I really believe that my country, Brazil, has a problem with memory. Um, it's not only about film preservation, which is also a problem. We have lost so much material over the years. It's very hard to find the archive from, television stations, local and also national television. We lost a lot of our film production from the early days of cinema until the 1950s, and also more. But politically, I really believe there is almost an attempt to keep things forgotten, almost like an Ozempic of amnesia that I believe that my country takes. In 1979, 2 years after the events in the film, we had the amnesty law. The amnesty law was proposed very cynically by the military. Basically, let's forget everything that has happened in the military regime and let's begin again. Let's forgive everything and everyone. And I think that had a traumatic effect on Brazilian psyche. And I think memory is one of the strongest themes, I think, everywhere in literature and in cinema. Today we are dealing with not only the natural difficulty in remembering, but also we have new tools to cover history up and change history and manipulate history. From a little manipulation of a photograph with AI, which now becomes a new photograph with changes. And now a building looks a little different. And maybe the people walking on the street, they look different. All of that, I think, is a fascinating theme for us to discuss. And I always wanted The Secret Agent to be a film about storytelling, but also about how storytelling can be altered, either through amnesia or for political manipulation, you know.
Wagner, tu nel 77, il film si svolge nel 77, avevi solo un anno, però la dittatura militare è durata fino all'85. Che ricordi hai tu di quel periodo e di quell'infanzia?
It's interesting because the dictatorship ended in 85, but it didn't, I was born in 76, so I was born during the dictatorship, but it didn't really end in 85. The echoes of the dictatorship that kept happening and going in Brazil until today, I think. Bolsonaro is a manifestation of not only of the dictatorship, but from the history of our country, of colonization, slavery. Bolsonaro didn't come from out of space, from Mars. He's deeply grounded in our history of violence, of elitism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, all these things. Brazil it's also a country with amazing things and amazing qualities, but it's undeniable. But it's a country that's built over a history of things that ended up in our successively dictatorships, and the dictatorship that they had from 64, from 85 is not the first one. We have a history of dictatorship, of coup d'etats. A coup d'etat they just tried one recently, and for the first time, people that were responsible for that went to jail. Well, Bolsonaro is in jail right now. The military people were in jail. We are in jail in Brazil for the first time. So I think that we are finally fixing the problem that Kleber was talking about, the memory problem that Brazil has, which is indeed a thing. So when you talk about memories, it's not like a memory, it's more like a feeling of being Brazilian. Like you grow up with also the way the history is told in Brazil. The history is always told through the point of view of the so-called winners. So I myself directed a film in Brazil about the leader of the resistance in Brazil, because a guy called Carlos Marighella, because his name was erased from our history. When I was a kid, I didn't study anything about native Brazilian people. I didn't know anything about Africans that were brought to Brazil as slaves. The history is always told through the point of view of the winners, and I think that cinema has a way, or it's not. We don't make films for that, but it has also that effect in bringing back memory and all that. So, to answer your question, long story short, of course, I remember my parents. I remember the albums of photos of when I was a kid during the dictatorship. All those Beatles, the Volkswagen Beatles, and all the way people used to wear my father used to wear his shirts like open up, like with the chest, like bare chest, is like my character does. He used to place a pack of cigarette in his left pocket and all that. So I have all that memories, but I think it's more than a memory. It's more like a feeling of what it is to be Brazil, to living in a country like that.
Kleber, perché Walter era l'attore perfetto per questo ruolo? Come vi siete incontrati? Perché c'è questa vostra passione mutua da così tanti anni?
Well, we met 20 years ago at the Cannes Film Festival. I was a film critic and he had a film at Un Certain Regard, a Brazilian film called Cidade Baixa by Sérgio Machado. And It was the first time I talked to him and I interviewed him as a critic. And at the time, I already knew he was something special in terms of a very interesting actor. But I also liked the person, the guy. And we kept in touch over many years, and he came out with Tropa de Elite, which became a huge hit in Brazil, an iconic role. Then he saw my film Neighboring Sounds, which he liked very much. And that's when we began the idea of developing something together. And I finally sat down to write The Secret Agent, thinking that it could be an interesting role for him. And what I did was I knew his work and I knew his films and I knew his work on television, and I had seen one play he did in the theater. And I thought that this film could take him some other place, could could be something good for him and also good for the film, and to have a different Wagner. And maybe not only a different Wagner, but maybe three different Wagners, which was an interesting challenge. Um, but above all, it's not only about hiring an actor. It was more like working with someone I liked. During the Bolsonaro years, we kind of called each other and reacted to all the crazy shit that was taking place in my country, and we are both vocal. I mean, I made other films, and he also made Marighella, and I would end up with a microphone in my hand and people asking me questions, and what do you think of Bolsonaro? And I would say, well, I don't think he's good for this country, and that would be put enough to make me a communist in Brazil. And yeah, and I think we shared experiences about all of that, and I'm just so happy that I worked with Wagner. I think he's a very good, working partner, and a pretty good face for the film.
He's got the star quality.
It does, yeah.
Wagner, hai lavorato moltissimo all'estero, hai una carriera internazionale, hai dovuto imparare lo spagnolo per la serie Narcos, lavori in inglese. Quanto è stato liberatorio tornare in Brasile, lavorare con lui e soprattutto parlare nella tua lingua?
It's very liberating. So I didn't learn English nor Spanish when I was a kid. Nowadays, like you see these little kids that they just can't speak languages because they see they watch Netflix in English since they were like little babies. So I only started to speak English when I had to go out there with my films to festivals and to answer questions about what I was doing. And I only learned Spanish to play Narcos, to do that series. So it's again, it's a. I think we go back to the memory thing because when I speak Portuguese, when I work in Portuguese, the words they come out of my mouth filled with memory. I think that's the difference because intellectually I understand what the words are in English or in Spanish, or I wish in Italian. I'm working on it. This is because it's the più bella lingua del mondo. Io ho studiato un po' di italiano, non posso dire che parlo, ma io capisco tutto.
Se stai più di 2 mesi qua parlerai italiano, sicuro.
Capisco bene. So yeah, I think that's the most important thing in terms of speaking a language. It's like to have an emotional connection with it, and so it was I was away of Brazilian cinema as an actor because I had directed Marighella in 2017, but I was away of our industry as an actor for 12 years. It's crazy because I'm very connected to my country, like culturally, politically. I'm there all the time. I was just doing a play in Brazil right now, but I spent 12 years away from it as an actor, and that was because of I was doing Narcos, I was directing Marighella, and then there were the Bolsonaro years where basically our industry was like destroyed. He's as any other fascist. He's against culture, and our industry is still pretty much dependent on public funding, and also the pandemic, and also was doing films in the US, which was something that I wanted to explore. But the best way to come back to shoot a film in Brazil was working with Kleber, who I was, like he said, when I saw his first film, Neighboring Sounds, which, by the way, if you haven't seen it, just go and see us, and it's a great film. And I became obsessed with working with him right after seeing that film. And so yeah, but what really brought us together for this one, like I said, was actually politics. The way we were both being vocal against Bolsonaro, and the way we were both suffering the consequences of what we were saying and what the kind of things that we were doing. Like my film Marighella was censored in Brazil, which was a very incredible thing. It was incredible.
Censored.
It's censored, not censorship like the way it was during the dictatorship.
Not official censorship.
It's more like a cynical thing. Like they made it impossible for me to release my film there. In the bureaucracy of Vancini, which is the agency that regulates cinema in the country.
Cynical censorship is different from official censorship. Cynical is like, oh, I forgot that folder under the desk, I think. Oops. And then the process is just delayed and delayed. And in the 70s, there was official censorship. For example, the Pasolini films, for example, Salò and Decameron, they were prohibited in Brazil. And they only arrived in the 80s. That was official censorship. With Wagner's film, it was more like, yeah, cynical censorship, cynical sabotage of the film. Yeah.
It's terrible, it's a torture. Tornando alla memoria e al passato, in Italia nel 78 c'erano gli anni di piombo, Moro era stato assassinato, e intanto nei cinema c'erano film di genere, di commediacce, horror, film catastrofici, film exploitation che si vedono molto anche nel tuo film. Era un modo per sfuggire dalla realtà o in realtà rispecchiavano la violenza di quel periodo?
Well, I think that the 70s is one of the strongest decades for cinema, probably with the 30s and the 40s, looking at the United States. In Brazil, something really interesting happened. There was a lot of censorship, but the censorship was very much applied to the ideas, dangerous ideas. So this is why Salò, for example, would not be shown in, or some of the Costa Gavras films. That was banned. And Zed was banned, yeah, it was banned. But one thing happened in the Brazilian film industry. They were relaxed about sex comedies. But the sex comedies, they had tits and ass, but no genitalia. That was forbidden. In fact, Clockwork Orange was banned by Stanley Kubrick. It came out in 1977 with special little black balls following the genitalia of the characters. And
so it was an invitation to...
It was almost like...
arousing for the...
yeah, it was almost like an art project about censorship, you know? Because it was so ridiculous. And unfortunately, none of the prints survived, because it would be great to see the prints with the little black dots following the genitalia.
was like a karaoke.
Yes, almost. Yeah. So sex comedies were very strong in Brazilian cinema, but political films were had a lot of problems with the censorship. Um, you mentioned Moro, and it's interesting that I have now the opportunity to say something. The the photograph of Wagner's character when he is found dead at the end of the film. Yeah, it's a very frank, honest photograph of the way that photojournalism used to be in the past, and photojournalism has changed a lot in 50 years. But when I was 9 years old, I saw a weekly magazine in Brazil which had the photographs of the kidnapping of Aldo Moro with the dead security men, and there was a dead one on the street, and maybe two or three in the car. And I found that so shocking. I never forgot those pictures. And when I was thinking about the ending, and I wanted a picture of his character dead or in the newspaper, that was the main reference that I had for the film, which is a very disrespectful photograph of the dead person with all the details and no attempt to hide anything. And I thought that would be the one image that would reveal what happened to him. And I just said this because you mentioned, the whole situation at the time. But I think the 70s is a very strong moment in cinema because I think a heightened sense of realism was used. Even a horror film like The Exorcist has a very palpable sense of realism, which I think explains the success of that film because it's the perfect mixture of realism and fantastique. And this is something that I really like in the way that I worked with The Secret Agent. It's very naturalistic and realistic, but then it also allows itself to open a portal into the fantastique, into the absurd. And I really like that mix, the mixture of both.
It's beautiful.
Wagner, tu che film amavi da piccolo? Anche tu guardavi film horror, eri uno appassionato di film di genere. Quali sono i film che ti hanno dato voglia di vivere su quel grande schermo?
Well, if I understood well the question, the kind of films I remember as like the references. Yeah, when I was and the movie that to be very, and then it will feel like that I'm trying to please the audience, which is not true. But it's Italian neorealism. Wow, it's like for me when my father used to show me films like Rocco and Suoi Fratelli, or Rome, Open City, or High School Thieves, and I think that had a huge influence on me, and not only on me. I think that it had a big influence in Brazilian cinema, in Brazilian political films, because the Italian films from the post-war were shot with non-professional actors with handheld cameras, or like in real locations. You can see that clearly in Cinema Novo's Brazilian movement, and even in films like Elite Squad, like City of God. Or it's a huge influence, I think, for the way, the idea that the Brazilian mantra of like a camera on the shoulder and an idea in the hand. I think that has a lot to do with. I'm always fascinated by realism in films, and I love. I mean, I also like all kinds of. I'm fascinated by Kleber's films and the way he creates this sense of mystery and terror in a simple scene.
There is always tension.
And there's always tension. was amazing. But I also love just, I love Ken Loach's films or Mike Lee's films or the Dardenne brothers films. I like films about working class people, and I come from a very humble background, and I like to see people, real people in films. And I think that it comes a lot from the Italian films that I've seen when I was really young.
Bene ragazzi, spazio alle domande. Se avete domande, tocca a voi.
When the woman is going to depose, I think, in the police station, it reminded me of something real that happened in Brazil, and I found it really interesting how you incorporated it into the film, and you like showed how the police were protecting the woman instead of the mother who lost her child. And I was wondering how you were inspired, what inspired you, and how you were inspired by real facts and real history that happened in Brazil to bring it into the film.
That's a really interesting question, and I have heard that question a few times before, but it's always good to go back to it because I'm not sure if you remember, but there is a woman who is going to give a statement at the police station organized by the police chief Euclides and his sons. And there was an accident in her home, and she caused the death of a little girl who works for her maid. And that is loosely based on something that happened in Recife a few years ago. But I always say that it's not really based on a story, but it's based on the logic of the country. It's based on the logic of society. And I think when I was writing that whole sequence, which is a very extensive sequence, and that sequence is actually about theater. It's about the theater of justice. Justice not being served, but being acted as justice, but there is very little actual justice taking place. And so many people make the association with the story of the boy who died because of how irresponsible the woman was. In fact, in a completely different situation. But in fact, I have to say that I kept remembering this provincial, terrible, very bad provincial judge called Sérgio Moro. He developed, he put together this theater of justice to incriminate a politician who happened to be Lula. And I, as a Brazilian citizen, I was always astonished at how incompetent he was and how mediocre he was to think that everybody would fall for the theater that he was putting together to incriminate and to basically crucify, almost like in a Christian way, one man whom he seemed to despise a lot. And I think that was the heart of the whole sequence, the theater of justice, rather than that one specific incident. That's probably the fullest answer I've ever given to that question.
Bom dia, Kleber, Wagner. Nossa, sono così contenta di vedervi. Questo film, secondo me, ci sono tante cose locali che parlano proprio del Brasile. Io sono brasiliana, la mia madre è di Bahia, sì, Wagner, e il mio padre è di São Paulo. E tra nord e sud del Brasile ci sono tante differenze. Questo succede anche in Italia. E ci sono anche altri elementi di località e universalità. Quando vedo quell'albergo della donna Sebastiana, cioè io sento veramente che ormai è una voglia che tutti oggi al mondo che soffrono una persecuzione, che soffrono una discriminazione. Tutti vogliamo trovare una persona così. C'è un piccolo oasis di speranza, di accoglimento. E lo vedo veramente, mi dà tanta speranza vedere una cosa del genere. E vorrei tanto che la gente fuori Brasile conosca anche il nord-est, quindi sono veramente contenta di vedere questo film essere il nostro candidato all'Oscar. Questo ci ha spinto tanta gente internazionale a riconoscere ancora di più il Brasile, che non è solo il centro-sud, diciamo Rio e São Paulo, e anche di vedere come la gente che non è del nord-est, anche in Brasile, hanno un'idea diversa del nord-est, no? Del lavoro che facciamo noi, i nostri antenati lì. Io mi ricordo da ragazzina che andavo sempre in ferie in Bahia, quando tornavo a São Paulo, era difficile di spiegare l'esperienza lì, perché veramente è un altro mondo. Vorrei chiedere, insomma, come ha fatto a catturare questi elementi così locali com essência universal. Muito obrigada, Kleber. Desculpa de fazer a pergunta em italiano, mas é mais fácil para todo mundo entender. Obrigada.
Well, I think that's always a wonderful question, but I think the best stories and the best storytelling, and I think we can all agree, thinking about literature again and film, that as far as you're truthful about what you're telling and the place where you're telling your story, I mean, look at Amacor by Fellini. It's such a specific place in the world, and it's such a specific place in Italy, but still, it's a film that was seen and felt everywhere. It was bought by the Americans who released Amacor in American cinemas in the 1970s. And it was released in Brazil, and it has become a symbol of a wonderful film about remembering and about some kind of nostalgia and about memories and all those characters. So I think that if you tell a story with the frankness and the honesty of knowing what you're talking about, and maybe the characters that you remember as alive and as full of energy, that should work. But at the same time, I do not have the formula for that, because I don't think there is a formula. I just think that when I write, I think of so many people that I have met, and maybe one character is a combination of three amazing people that I know or that I used to know. There is one character that those who have seen my previous film, Pictures of Ghosts, you will see the real man, Alexandre, and then for this film I wrote a fictional version of him, which is not really him, but there is a lot of him in that fictional character. And Recife is the place which I know, and I know how to shoot it. I enjoy taking pictures of Recife. I enjoy placing the camera and shooting that city, because I think it has many interesting layers. And right now in Brazil, the film is in the cinemas. We are very close to 1 million tickets in Brazil, which is a very good thing. And people are, I mean, the film has caught fire, and there is all kinds of debate and discussions around the film. And the film is popular everywhere, but there are some people in São Paulo and in the Southeast that they say, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure I understand this film. I think it's too regional for me. And what the fuck is regional, you know? I think that telenovelas from Rio are regional for me, because I come from the Northeast, you know? I think films in New York City for me are regional. But the industry tells me that New York is not regional. New York is the center of the universe, you know? So I don't know. I think Amacor is universal. And I think Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing is universal. And I want The Secret Agent to be universal as well. You know? And it is.
It is.
Complimenti per il film. La cosa che mi ha toccato di più in particolare è come hai raccontato l'amore che hai per il cinema e per la sala cinematografica in particolare. E mi ha ricordato quando ero piccola e come il bambino protagonista del film aveva paura di qualcosa, ma vedendolo nella sala cinematografica quella paura scompariva. E per me, che sono cresciuta con la sala cinematografica, e vedere per esempio in Italia che scompaiono sempre di più le sale cinematografiche, diciamo, veder sostituita la sala cinematografica alla fine del film con l'ospedale è stato un colpo al cuore. Quindi quello che ti chiedo è: tu pensi che la sala cinematografica oggi sia ancora il primo posto vero dove poter vedere i film e dove poter amare il cinema? O credi che ci sia un'evoluzione e debba esserci un'evoluzione? Cioè, come vedi questa cosa? Grazie.
No, I think cinemas are always the best place to see a film. But I'm the kind of person who works with adding rather than subtracting. So I think I'll always have cinemas. And I've been so lucky that over since May, when this film screened in Cannes, I'm screening The Secret Agent in I think the best cinemas in the world, you know, from the Gartenbau Kino in Vienna to the BFI in London and the Alice Tully Hall in New York City, and the list is very long. Cinema, I think, is a place where people meet and where people share an experience. And watching a really great film with an audience is incomparable. I also think that with time, I will be happy after the film is screened in all the cinemas, after it does all the theatrical screenings, and you know, after its natural life in cinemas comes to an end, I will actually be happy to know that you can see it on streaming on 4K with HDR, and I'm even all right with knowing that someone saw the film on an iPhone. It's terrible, but yes, why not, you know? I once read that for my first film, Neighboring Sounds, I think it was a young boy, he said, oh, finally, after 2 weeks, I finished Neighboring Sounds, which is, it's terrible, but, you know, he saw it, and that's the way he found of watching the film.
Effort.
Yeah, it's like a 2-hour film with TikTok mentality. Like I saw it in 75 times. You know,
They watch it fast forward.
of course, in twice the speed. Why not? But it's all part of what it is. It's all part of the game. But I'm still a programmer myself. It's still my day job. That's how I still enjoy myself, thinking special programs, having the desire to program a film, a classic, or maybe a wonderful new film with a classic and how they can dialogue, and showing short films, for example, and special programs for kids. This is something that I still enjoy, and I think cinemas are the best, and I think it's so incredible that you have in Rome a place like this to see films. So in a way, you're very lucky. And I think I've been traveling to cities like Berlin and Los Angeles, of course, and São Paulo, where there are wonderful places for people to meet and gather and share, you know, the experience of watching films. And I will always work seriously to keep places like this alive.
Cathedrals of Dreams.
Yeah.
Grazie a tutti, veramente.
Muito obrigado.